At the beginning, a girl named Antonia is seen, determined and driven by the urgency to hurry. She is desperate to be able to speak, believing that only through this can she protect everything precious to her. A boy then appears, calling out her name and asking her to stop for a moment. He identifies her as Antonia Sirhi, 28 years old. Antonia, resolute, requests him to let go of her hand. The boy tries to explain, claiming it was a misunderstanding, asserting that the lowly person had come on to him. Antonia reflects on the situation, finding it bad enough that he was already involved with a maid, but then to parade her around the mansion without any regard for common decency was too much. Finally, she declares her decision, stating she wants a divorce, and that she can't endure this any longer. In a sudden and desperate move, the boy brings both hands toward Antonia's neck, shouting her name. Antonia rises from the bed, her head aching as she tries to piece together what happened. She wonders if she fainted, noticing that the maids must have moved her, but she's puzzled as to why she isn't in her own room. Realization dawns on her as she grasps the rope beside her, recognizing that this is the room she used when she was young. Just then, maid Dora enters, and Antonia is taken aback, wondering why Dora is there, recalling that she was kicked out 10 years ago. Dora, however, addresses her with a hint of impatience, mentioning that Antonia had asked for water, and remarking that she should get it herself. Dora points out that although Antonia is mute, the rest of her body is fine, so she doesn't need anything else. Frustrated, Dora expresses how tiring it is to keep going back and forth to attend to her. Antonia tries to make sense of her surroundings, thinking that this must be a dream. She can't believe that Dora was ever this young when she worked here. As she stands up from the bed, her body aches all over, making her wonder if she got beat up in her sleep. Her legs feel weak, and as she catches her reflection in the mirror, she's startled by what she sees. She's young again, resembling how she looked during the most frustrating time of her life. Memories flood back. The time when she lost her beloved parents in a carriage accident. A loss so profound that she lost her ability to speak and show emotion due to the shock. She struggled deeply with their deaths, and eventually, she met her own tragic end. She recalls how she was used, exploited, and stolen from, unable to do anything she truly wanted. At the age of 28, she died, feeling powerless and unfulfilled. Antonia reflects on her situation, thinking that she always had a premonition that things would turn out this way. Now that she's been given a chance to return to the past, she resolves not to live her life the same way again. She vows that she will never endure such suffering a second time. Determined, she believes she can reclaim everything she lost and is set on making those responsible pay for all the wrongs done to her. Dora enters and complains about Antonia not showing any sympathy for her, suggesting that as a 12-year-old, Antonia should learn to take care of herself. Antonia, however, is aware of Dora's shortcomings, and realizes that Dora believes her inability to speak and lack of emotional expression means no one will discover how poorly she has been treated. 2 weeks after returning to the past, Antonia had figured out the state of affairs in her estate. Fortunately, her uncle had not yet taken full control of the mansion, and although some employees were loyal to him, many servants remained loyal to her parents. However, she knows that in 3 or 4 months, most of them will leave, as she was unable to speak, and it appeared she might never recover. After about 6 months, she managed to speak a little, but by then, it was too late. Her uncle had taken complete control, and she was powerless to resist his orders. He even threatened to marry her off to an 80-year-old man if she didn't comply. Reflecting on her situation, Antonia wonders if it might have been better to have accepted such a marriage as a precaution, especially since the old man died shortly after she turned 18. She contemplates whether this might be a viable option for her in her current predicament. Dora enters and sees something that Antonia is preparing, exclaiming with mock enthusiasm if Antonia made it for her. Antonia, annoyed by Dora's constant nonsense, thinks to herself that Dora is always speaking frivolously. Dora then takes the item, thanking Antonia, and playfully suggesting that only someone as pretty as herself should wear such things because they make her shine. She further praises Antonia's kind heart and good taste. Dora leaves, continuing to flatter Antonia insincerely, calling her a good person. Antonia, seething with anger, reflects on Dora's behavior, realizing that Dora has always been like this. She recalls how Dora would take anything she could, including the piece of lace she just took. Dora even had the audacity to flaunt the stolen items to other servants, compounding Antonia's frustration. Antonia recounts the situation involving Dora. A maid questions whether Dora really received the item from the young miss, expressing concern that Dora might have taken it without permission. Dora defensively responds, asking if she's being accused, and insists that doubting her means doubting the young miss. The maid clarifies that she's not accusing Dora, but emphasizes her own faithful service to the young miss. Overwhelmed with emotion, the maid starts crying, lamenting how unfair it is to look down on the young miss just because she can't speak. She asserts that the young miss is a sweet person, and claims she knows this better than anyone. Antonia reflects on how anyone who pointed out Dora's actions ended up being viewed as the bad guy, acknowledging Dora's shamelessness and wickedness. Despite this, she remembers that there were still people who saw through Dora's act, such as Martin. Martin approaches and asks the young miss to answer honestly if she truly gave all those things to Dora. Antonia thinks to herself that she has never given Dora anything. Dora simply took those things without permission. Martin reassures her not to worry and promises to sort out the situation. Antonia responds mentally with acceptance. A few days later, Dora remarks with satisfaction that the nosy chef Martin has finally been fired. She feels that Martin got what she deserved for trying to make both Dora and the young miss appear to be liars. Dora expresses her frustration, questioning why Martin would accuse her of stealing, and dismisses her as lacking sense. Dora continues, claiming that she is the only one kind enough to care for someone as annoying as the young miss. Antonia is holding a ring when Dora takes it from her hand, saying that she will take the ring as payment for all her hard work. Antonia becomes melancholic, thinking about Martin and whether she was fired just because she nodded once. She reflects on the fact that it was all because of her and remembers everything. Determined, Antonia resolves that this time, she will protect everything no matter what. The next morning, Dora enters Antonia's room and notices the clothes, commenting on them. When she sees the jewels, she assumes that Antonia is selecting which ones to give her. Antonia is perplexed, realizing that these are the only items her mother left her. Dora, smiling, admires the jewels and decides to take one, thanking Antonia for the gift and claiming that Antonia's generosity helps her endure. Antonia, frustrated, extends her hand in protest, thinking to herself that she does not want this. Dora, laughing, asserts that Antonia clearly wants her to have the jewel and says she will share the young miss's kindness with others. Dora then leaves the room. Antonia thinks to herself that she doesn't have many things left from her mother and declares that there will be no more left to give away. She opens the door and steps outside, where she sees Dora showing the maids the precious keepsake Antonia had intended to keep. The maids express surprise and acknowledge that Dora takes good care of Antonia. Dora, with a false air of modesty, claims that she serves the young miss faithfully every day without fail, and that she could never neglect someone so kind. The maid, noticing Antonia, exclaims in surprise at her presence and realizes they have been chatting with Dora for too long. She anxiously asks if Antonia was looking for Dora. Antonia grabs Dora's hand, who appears quite frightened. Dora hesitantly addresses Antonia, and Antonia firmly states, "That's mine," asserting her claim to the item Dora has taken. Dora stammers, addressing Antonia in shock. A man nearby exclaims in amazement, realizing that Antonia just spoke, while Martin expresses disbelief, saying he never thought he'd hear her voice again in his lifetime. Antonia acknowledges their reactions are natural but remains focused on the more pressing matter, getting her bracelet back. She firmly repeats to Dora that the bracelet is hers and demands its return. A maid, surprised, questions Dora, recalling that she claimed the young miss gave it to her and now accuses her of lying. Dora hesitates, while Antonia, though recognizing that it might seem childish, insists once more that Dora give the bracelet back. Antonia, realizing this is the best she can do for now, resolves to get her bracelet back. She expresses gratitude to Martin, thanking him as he approaches her. Meanwhile, Dora, fuming internally, wonders why Antonia suddenly started talking at such a crucial moment, thinking she should have just continued to listen to her and stayed hidden in her room. Despite her anger, Dora reassures herself that it's only a few words and believes she can still maneuver her way out of the situation. Antonia, however, internally criticizes Dora, thinking that all Dora can say now are basic demands like, "That's mine," and "give it back," making her seem foolish. Dora, feeling wronged, exclaims that this is so unjust, questioning why the young miss is suddenly acting this way. She insists that when she asked Antonia if she was giving her the bracelet, Antonia had nodded yes. Antonia, anticipating this response, thinks to herself that she knew Dora would try to twist the situation and silently acknowledges that she has a lot to make Dora pay for, more than just taking her mother's things. Dora, trying to justify herself, brings up an incident where she spilled water the day before, suggesting that this is the reason Antonia is supposedly framing her now. She recalls how she got down on her knees to beg for forgiveness at the time. In a desperate attempt to avoid being kicked out, Dora hurriedly removes the bracelet from her hand and offers it back to Antonia, pleading for mercy. Antonia reflects on how Dora truly is an incredible actress. Thinking that Dora should have pursued acting instead of being a maid, she would have excelled in it. As Antonia contemplates this, one maid tries to appeal to her, reminding her of all the good things Dora has done, urging Antonia to remember Dora's service. Another maid chimes in, insisting that Dora didn't mean any harm, and appeals to Antonia's kindness, hoping she will forgive. Antonia sees through their facade, recognizing that they are all aligned with her uncle. She notes with disgust how they've already chosen sides, even though she hasn't said anything yet, and questions who the true master of the household is. Taking the bracelet from Dora's hand, Antonia pointedly tells her that it seems like nothing but lies come out of her mouth whenever she speaks. Shocked, Dora accuses Antonia of tricking her, asking if she was merely pretending to be unable to speak. Antonia dismisses the idea, remarking that deceiving Dora wouldn't even be worth the effort. Then, in a bold move, Antonia slaps Dora hard across the face. The maids, startled, react immediately. One exclaims in shock, "Young miss," while the other protests that Antonia has gone too far. Yet, Antonia, though she's aware of her own physical weakness, feels that it's a pity she lacks the strength to deliver a stronger slap. Antonia reflects on how Dora has never once arrived on time to her room in the morning. Gathering her strength, she confronts Dora, asking if she truly believes Antonia has become so thin because of illness. Internally, Antonia feels as though her throat is being torn open, but she knows she needs to push through and say a few more things. She then reveals that Dora only brings her one meal a day and takes her belongings without permission. Finally, Antonia firmly declares that she has never given anything to Dora, making it clear to everyone that Dora has been taking advantage of her all along. Martin questioned Antonia, asking if what she said was true. He then turned to Dora, accusing her of not fulfilling her duties, stealing and lying, calling her a scoundrel. Dora, panicked, began to apologize, pleading with Antonia not to kick her out and promising never to repeat her actions. However, Antonia firmly ordered Dora to leave the mansion. Shocked, Dora stammered in disbelief, insisting that Antonia couldn't do this and demanded that Mrs. Mills be called. As Dora desperately called for Mrs. Mills, Antonia thought to herself whether Dora really believed that something would change if Mrs. Mills were summoned. Antonia, asserting her authority, reminds Dora that it is her mansion, and that she has given Dora enough chances. Dora, desperate and defiant, refuses to leave, insisting she does not want to go. As Antonia's throat reaches its limit, she firmly commands the servants to throw her out. The servants then grab Dora and begin to drag her out. Dora, in a panic, continues to plead with Antonia, insisting that everything she did was for her. Martin, urgent and stern, orders the servants to remove Dora immediately, emphasizing the need to protect Antonia's health. Antonia reflects on how she managed to expel Dora sooner than expected. She realizes that to regain her lost power within the estate, she needs to take further action. Martin, concerned for her well-being, approaches her and asks if she is all right, offering his support. Antonia, grateful, thanks him for his help. Tears well up in the maid's eyes as she reflects on why the young miss had become so thin. The man also thinks about how they were foolish to believe what Dora had said. He is certain that there was no way the young miss would have avoided seeing them. They resolve to take good care of the young miss from now on. Antonia, contemplating, feels that despite only being able to kick out Dora, she has grasped something much more important. She thinks she needs to take care of everything else as soon as possible. Antonia is sleeping on her bed when Mrs. Mills arrives. Mills is annoyed, thinking about how Antonia made her look foolish by kicking Dora out without consulting her. She cannot believe Antonia acted so arbitrarily. Mills expresses her concern that such actions will make things difficult. Antonia responds with confusion, and Mills realizes that Antonia is now able to speak. Mills then tells Antonia that she expelled Dora from the mansion without consulting her. Martin scoffs at the idea that the young miss needs to consult Mills on such a trivial matter. Mills insists that she must be consulted, emphasizing her role as the housekeeper of the mansion and her responsibility for managing the servants. Antonia responds abruptly, suggesting that if Mills is dissatisfied, she should simply quit. Mills, shocked by the suggestion, is taken aback and repeats, "What?" Antonia repeats her point, clearly stating that if Mills is unhappy, she should just quit. Antonia demands to know if Mills did not hear her, stating that if Mills is dissatisfied, she should just quit. She asserts that this is her mansion, and questions whether Mills holds more power than she does. Mills, stammering, tries to respond but is interrupted by Antonia asking if Mills's grievances are more important than her own health. Mills exclaims Antonia's name and then privately reflects on the situation. She is astonished by the shift in Antonia's demeanor, noting that Antonia no longer seems like a 12-year-old child, but rather as if she were a grown aristocratic lady. Martin, addressing Antonia, asks if she is all right, to which Antonia replies that her body feels weak. Martin then instructs Mills to leave immediately. Mills agrees to leave but reminds Antonia that her guardian, Lord Paulo, entrusted her with the management of the estate. Antonia thinks to herself that it is a simple matter and wonders why Mills is reacting so seriously to her words. She feels a sense of relief, recalling how she was once frightened of both Uncle and Mrs. Mills. Antonia continues her thoughts, remembering how, after her health improved, she was frequently punished and locked in an underground warehouse for trivial reasons. She also reflects on how Dora would blame her for any mistakes she made. Antonia recalls Mills's complaint about Dora's hard work and reflects on how Mills was upset over what she considered a trivial issue. She then remembers her uncle's criticism, feeling that, despite everyone going to great lengths for her, he didn't seem to appreciate it. Mills, in the present, insists that Antonia cannot come out until she has fully reflected on her actions. Antonia reflects on her past experiences, remembering that the shortest time she was kept in a cold, wet basement was 12 hours and the longest was a week. She endured these conditions despite her constant fear of being bitten by rats. After she became an adult, she cleaned up the basement and transformed it into something else. Martin, noticing her exhaustion, advises her to get some more rest. Antonia thinks to herself that her immediate priority is to recover her stamina, recognizing that neither Mrs. Mills nor her uncle will be as easily removed as Dora was. Martin advises the young miss to get some rest and assures her that she shouldn't worry about anything. He promises to have a sweet mulled wine prepared for her when she wakes up. Antonia thanks Martin and then thinks to herself that he is right. She decides that it's best to focus on her financial situation and her position in the household after she has had some rest. The scene shifts to the dining table where Antonia is eating. She reflects that Martin's cooking is the best, noting that she even finely ground the meat to accommodate her digestion problems. Antonia thinks about how Martin tailored the dishes specifically for her, and she hasn't enjoyed such meals since her parents passed away. Since Dora was expelled, Martin has been at odds with Mrs. Mills. Miad offers more tea, while another maid suggests trying a different dish. Observing this, Antonia feels grateful that the kitchen staff has been taking care of her in place of her personal maid. She reflects that, thanks to their care, she feels a bit more comfortable and no longer has to put on an act. She is relieved that she doesn't need to act meek and silent in front of people like Dora or Mrs. Mills anymore. Martin advises the young miss to eat slowly, warning that if she continues eating so quickly, they might need to call the doctor again, just like last time. The two maids discuss among themselves, wondering how long Dora must have starved the young miss for her to eat in such a manner. One maid reflects on how their young lady was always pure and elegant, never showing a wrinkle. Meanwhile, Martin thinks about how, as the successor of the county, the young miss has always been dignified and generous to her servants. He recalls believing Dora's claims of receiving precious things from the young miss, assuming they were true. Martin reassures Antonia that if there is anything she would like to eat, she should not hesitate to tell him, and he will make whatever she desires. When Antonia expresses surprise, Martin emphasizes that he means it, mentioning how empty he felt when she didn't come down to eat for the past 2 years. Antonia recalls the time when her parents were alive and they all ate together in the same room. She remembers her mother once scolding Martin, saying, "What will happen if you only give her what she wants to eat?" And how her father happily ate cream stew for a week, even when the ingredients only changed weekly, always laughing joyfully as he ate. Antonia thanks Martin, admitting that she really missed his cooking. Touched, Martin responds with a simple, heartfelt acknowledgement. Antonia adds that she finds his food delicious because she knows he thinks of her when he prepares it. The maids reflect on how their young miss used to be the type of person who only wanted to eat the same thing every day, but now she's saying she likes everything. They are outraged, wondering how Dora and Mrs. Mills could have treated their precious young miss so poorly. Martin, addressing Antonia, expresses that it brings him joy to cook for her. When Antonia questions this, Martin smiles and explains that it makes him happy to prepare whatever she desires to eat. Antonia is surprised, realizing that someone can find happiness in something like that, whereas she always found it burdensome to organize her husband's meals. She then considers that perhaps Martin might also feel stressed about deciding what to cook. Deciding to be considerate, Antonia tells Martin that she will think carefully about what she wants to eat. Martin encourages her to do so, pleased by her response. Antonia steps into the garden with a maid and reflects on how much the atmosphere within the mansion has changed. She acknowledges that she still struggles to show any expressions on her face, despite diligently practicing since she woke up in the past. The best she can manage is a small smile, and she wonders why she isn't improving. She recalls how, before she died, there were no occasions for her to smile or laugh. Her husband used to curse her for being emotionless whenever he was in a bad mood. And at that time, she genuinely believed everything was her fault. As they stand in the garden, the maid suggests that they head back inside, as staying out in the cold wind for too long wouldn't be good for Antonia's health. Antonia agrees, and thinks to herself that she now realizes it wasn't her fault. She finally understands this because she is surrounded by people who sincerely care about her. Before, she didn't smile because she had no reason to, and even getting angry felt pointless since it never changed anything. The next morning, as Antonia is eating, Martin notices her pace and comments that there's no need to rush, as no one is going to steal her food. Antonia, realizing her speed, apologizes, explaining that she forgot to slow down because the food was so delicious. Martin reassures her that there's plenty more and encourages her to eat slowly, reminding her that they don't want her to get another stomachache. Antonia closes her eyes and reflects on how they had to call the doctor twice in the last 2 weeks, due to her digestion issues. She reminds herself to calm down, noting that these are the same servants who took care of her when she was very small. She then thinks about how in her previous life, after her parents passed away, she never enjoyed such luxury again. Antonia continues to reflect on her past, recalling how her uncle was always concerned with how others perceived him. He tried to train her to be obedient and graceful, even attempting to make her as slender as possible. Also, he could boast about how well he had taken care of his niece after he claimed the title of Count for himself. However, in the end, her uncle's dream was never realized. Despite the dark days, she was the one who was granted the title of Countess, not her uncle. Yet, she acknowledges that she didn't achieve this title through her own power, a bittersweet reality she had to live with until the end of her life. Mills enters the dining room and begins by addressing Antonia, stating that there is something she'd like to discuss. However, she quickly turns her attention to Martin, expressing outrage at the sight before her. She questions how Martin could serve such meat-heavy dishes to the young miss, especially when she is already perfectly slender and willowy. Martin, clearly displeased, dismisses her concerns as nonsense, emphasizing that this is the time when Antonia should be growing the most. He challenges Mills, asking what she means by slender and willowy, and angrily points out that it's because of the horrible treatment by Dora that Antonia is now only skin and bones. Mills insists that she is only acting for the sake of the young miss, but Martin retorts sharply, questioning how she could claim to be looking out for Antonia's well-being when she failed to manage Dora's misdeeds. Hearing this, Mills becomes enraged and demands that Antonia should have stopped them. Antonia, puzzled, questions why she should have done that. Mills insists that Lord Paolo had said so, but Antonia responds that she enjoys eating delicious things and sees no reason why she shouldn't have them. She then questions Mrs. Mills about why she is so much bigger than Antonia Mills. Taken aback, asks what she means. Antonia picks up some food from her plate and points out that even her uncle's belly was quite large. She challenges the idea that being slender and willowy is desirable by questioning why her uncle's body was so thick if that were the case. Her provocative remarks only serve to infuriate Mills further. Mills stammers as she tries to respond to Antonia's questions. Antonia reflects that Lord Paolo was the one who said noble ladies should look a certain way, but she finds it frustrating to tell Mills that she doesn't need to be slender because she isn't a noble. Despite her newfound ability to speak, Antonia finds herself disliking Mills even more. A maid arrives and announces that today's dessert is sherbet. Mills, still flustered, wonders how she can regain the upper hand and hasn't figured out how to reply effectively. Antonia, observing Mills's behavior, thinks she is simple-minded and realizes Mills came to find her for a specific reason. Antonia reminds Mills that she mentioned wanting to discuss something, and Mills confirms they need to assign another personal maid to the young miss. Antonia responds that she is actually fine at the moment. Mills insists, pointing out that the kitchen staff have their own duties to attend to. Martin and another maid both assert that they are happy to take care of Antonia, but Mills insists that it is inappropriate for a noble lady to be attended to by a kitchen servant. She presents a list of candidates for Antonia to choose from. As Antonia reviews the file, she thinks that she shouldn't expect the kitchen staff to attend to her forever, especially since they have to work overtime. Mills claims that all the candidates are smart and diligent workers, prompting Antonia to question if this is truly the case. Mills, seeing Antonia's hesitation, insists that the candidates are indeed smart and diligent. Antonia, however, recalls that Mills had said the same about Dora when she was brought in. Mills, caught off guard, tries to assure Antonia that these new candidates are different. Antonia suspects Mills might be trying to deceive her, and questions if she really needs to select a personal maid. Mills emphasizes the importance of maintaining the dignity of the future countess, making it clear that a personal maid is essential. Antonia scans the file and expresses a preference for Lorena. Mills is taken aback, pointing out that Lorena is around Antonia's age and has worked in the mansion for a similar amount of time. She argues that Lorena, being inexperienced and only trained in menial chores, is not suited to attend to Antonia. Antonia responds that Lorena can simply learn the necessary skills. Antonia insists that Lorena can be effectively trained with the help of Martin, who can provide thorough instruction. Martin supports this, expressing confidence that with his guidance, Lorena will be a better maid than Dora ever was. Mills protests, doubting Lorena's capability due to her lack of experience with higher duties. Antonia counters Mills's concerns by pointing out that Martin has been expertly handling her hair and dress unlike Dora, and that Martin, who was once her mother's personal maid, is more than capable of training Lorena. She questions how Mills could not be aware of Martin's background and expertise. Mills stumbles, acknowledging she knew Martin's previous role but failing to provide a convincing response. Antonia recalls that even the sous chef was from the Marquis' household, and taunts Mills for her lack of knowledge, hinting at her own plans to dismiss most of the servants. She implies that Mills's ignorance about Dora's true nature as a thief explains the failures in managing the household. Antonia observed the scene, reflecting on the struggles everyone had endured because of Dora. She felt a sense of relief, knowing that the maids now found comfort in her presence, grateful to have her as their support. The atmosphere had lightened with Dora's departure, a sentiment shared by the others. Antonia realized this was the first time in decades that she had people she could truly trust. Within the mansion, she found allies in the kitchen staff, Polly, Lorena, and even the stable keeper, Mr. Roto. This newfound trust gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. Antonia continued to reflect on the situation within the mansion. She recognized that while she had gained some allies, Mrs. Mills and those loyal to her uncle still held the majority. However, she also understood that their loyalty was fragile, driven more by the need to earn a living than by genuine allegiance. This made the task of dealing with them seem less daunting. Antonia knew that to regain any real power, she needed to create a division between Mrs. Mills and her uncle. If her uncle were to return now, it would complicate matters, so it was crucial to further isolate Mrs. Mills first. Once that rift was firmly in place, then, and only then, would she be ready for her uncle to return. As Antonia wrote the letter to her uncle, she carefully chose her words, expressing deep gratitude for his presence in her life. She mentioned how, without him, she would be in tears every day, with no one to turn to, and how the estate would be in disarray without his guidance. She emphasized Mrs. Mills's care for her, mentioning how she had taken charge of all her meals and even ensured that the water she used was suitable, all to ensure her comfort. Antonia subtly credited all of this to her uncle's concern for her well-being. As she penned these words, Antonia thought carefully about how she was crafting the image of a naive and kind-hearted niece. However, when it came to Mrs. Mills and Dora, she knew she needed to change her approach slightly. She contemplated adding a note about how heartbroken Mrs. Mills had been, hinting at the terrible way Dora had taken advantage of her kindness. Antonia wanted to convey her concern that Mrs. Mills might have been irreparably hurt by this betrayal. Antonia knew that she needed to make her uncle believe she relied on him and thought of him constantly. She had no intention of altering the facts of what had happened, but planned to change the tone of how these events were presented. She believed that this subtle manipulation would be enough to sway her uncle. Antonia pondered over her strategy, understanding that people often convince themselves of the things they want to believe. Her uncle, she knew, was the type of person who despised criticism and bad news, responding only to praise. This knowledge worked in her favor. Since her uncle wanted to use her, she was confident he would try to make himself seem indispensable to her. As for Mrs. Mills, she assumed her uncle was already aware of her tendency to complain. Antonia felt that the laborious process she was enduring would soon come to an end, and she was determined to reach the finish line, no matter what. She then instructed one of the maids to bring some food to Mr. Roto the next time she saw him, knowing she would need to continue sending letters through him in the future. The maid, taking the letter, assured her, "Of course, my lady, leave it to me." As she watched the maid leave, Antonia reflected on her actions. She needed her uncle to believe that she was immature and weak, that she was sending him letters because she desperately needed his love. The more he believed this, the slower he would be to make any moves against her. This was all part of her carefully calculated plan. On the other side, Mills was seen reading the letter, her frustration mounting as she read the words, "She's still young and immature, so please be a bit more patient." Anger surged within her as she recalled how she had sent a detailed letter about all the misdeeds of that brat, even exaggerating some aspects to make her point clear. In a fit of rage, Mills threw the paper on the table, feeling betrayed. She had been working tirelessly, with only Lord Paulo to rely on, and now, this was how he repaid her? Mills took a moment to compose herself, reminding herself of her position. She was the woman who would soon become his wife. She could not afford to lose her dignity now. Perhaps the letter she had written was too emotional. She considered how, to someone like Lord Paulo, who had lived his entire life as a nobleman, the lower classes might seem overly excitable. She began to ponder how she could write about the brat's deeds without coming across as too emotional. How could she convey her concerns effectively? In this moment of reflection, Mills remembered why she had invested so much money in books on painting and aristocratic magazines from the capital. Whenever she looked at them, she could almost feel as though she had already become a countess, living the life she aspired to. A maid burst into Mills' room, flinging the door open in haste. Mills, startled by the intrusion, immediately reprimanded her, asking why she was yelling and reminding her to knock and enter quietly. The maid, flustered, quickly apologized but stammered that something urgent had happened. Mills, growing impatient, demanded to know what had occurred. The maid explained that the designer and some seamstresses had just entered the mansion. Mills was momentarily taken aback, thinking that perhaps Lord Paulo had sent them to make her a New Year's dress to match his suit. But the maid quickly clarified that it was the young miss who had called for them, and that they were already in her room. A wave of anger surged through Mills as she processed this information. How dare the young miss decide to spend money without even consulting her? This audacity was infuriating. Mills's thoughts churned with frustration as she grappled with this latest affront to her authority. Meanwhile, the designer greeted Antonia warmly, remarking that it had been a long time since she had last seen her. She mentioned that lately, only servants from the estate had visited her shop, which had caused her some concern. Antonia, maintaining her composure, replied that she hadn't had the time to visit in a while, but thanked the designer for her concern. As the designer looked at Antonia, she couldn't help but notice how thin the young miss appeared. Concerned, she thought to herself that the guardian responsible for Antonia's care must be neglecting her. Pushing these thoughts aside, the designer began to suggest starting with their catalog. However, before she could continue, Mills suddenly entered the room, her face flushed with anger. She addressed Antonia sharply, demanding to know how she could summon a designer and seamstresses without informing her first. Mills made it clear that Antonia should have sought her permission before making such decisions, her frustration evident in her tone. Antonia observed Mills's reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity. She noted with a touch of exasperation how Mills always seemed to act precisely as she anticipated, as if predictable. Turning her attention to the designer, Antonia reflected on her reputation as a well-known source of gossip. She knew that any story the designer heard would likely spread throughout town within 3 days or less. The glint in the designer's eyes made it clear to Antonia that the rumors would start circulating immediately. Antonia addressed Mills with a feigned innocence, questioning what she meant by permission. Mills, her irritation clear, explained that Lord Paulo had entrusted her with the management of the estate and Antonia's affairs, including asset management. She emphasized that any significant expenditure, such as the one Antonia had initiated, could impact the estate's budget if not properly communicated. As Mills spoke, Antonia thought to herself about the blatant lack of respect she was receiving. Mills's tone conveyed not just a lack of respect but also contempt and ignorance. Antonia felt that Mills regarded her with nothing more than disdain, which only fueled her resolve to navigate this situation with precision. Antonia addressed Mills with a calm demeanor, acknowledging her concerns but asking her to remain calm as they had a guest present. She internally noted that Mills likely saw her as a vulnerable young lady under the control of an abusive guardian. Antonia recognized that Mills' behavior was likely to make others view her as a disrespectful servant who did not know her place. Turning to the designer, Antonia apologized for the interruption and requested her patience for a moment. The designer, ever accommodating, assured Antonia that she did not mind, and expressed her eagerness to assist. Antonia then instructed the maid to guide the designer to the parlor, which the maid promptly agreed to do. The maid began to lead the designer out, ensuring that the situation was managed smoothly and the designer was comfortably taken care of. Mills confronted Antonia, accusing her of avoiding admitting her mistake in front of the designer and claiming that Antonia should be grateful to her. Antonia, sipping her tea, responded nonchalantly, stating that she merely covered up the rude behavior of her housekeeper. Mills, growing frustrated, demanded to know what Antonia meant by rude behavior. She felt that Antonia was deflecting blame onto her rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing. Mills then declared that everything had been ordered by Lord Paolo, and thought to herself that Lord Paolo had emphasized not misusing the Count's assets. He had instructed that the servants be paid well, but the situation with Antonia was apparently different in Mills's view. Mills informed Antonia that Lord Paolo had instructed her to pay extra close attention to the estate's budget, particularly regarding any expenses related to Antonia. She elaborated that Lord Paolo had personally outlined a budget for Antonia for each season and emphasized that luxury was not advisable. Antonia asked if this meant her uncle had given these specific instructions. Mills confirmed, asserting that no matter how often Antonia claimed to be the owner of the mansion, the budgetary constraints imposed by Lord Paolo were non-negotiable. Antonia then asked if Mills would take responsibility for what she had said. Mills confidently agreed, though she privately reflected that while she might not be certain about everything, she was sure Lord Paolo had instructed them to be frugal with any spending on Antonia. Mills was determined not to fall out of favor with Lord Paolo. Antonia addressed Mills, suggesting that she might not be aware that the set budget could be increased if necessary, especially for the needs of a child of the household. She implied that if others discovered how frugal Mills had been with her finances, it might reflect poorly on the dignity of the aristocratic household. Antonia questioned whether her uncle would truly issue such strict instructions. Mills responded by challenging Antonia to verify the information with Lord Paolo if she did not believe her. Antonia pondered Mills' response, questioning the truthfulness of her claims. Antonia confronted Mills, reminding her that she had accused Antonia of calling in a designer and seamstresses without permission. Mills defended herself, saying that none of Antonia's so-called goody two-shoes servants had consulted her. Antonia then presented a letter from her uncle, Lord Paolo, startling Mills. As Mills read the letter, she struggled to understand why Lord Paolo would have sent such a communication to Antonia. Antonia clarified that she had indeed received her uncle's permission and pointed out that it was getting late and she still did not have a proper dress. After reading the letter, Mills realized it was true. Lord Paolo had instructed that Antonia should get the dress she wanted made. Mills was perplexed as to why Lord Paolo had not mentioned this to her. Antonia, pressing her point, asked Mills if she had anything else to say.